Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some PathOfExile discussion. I wanted to do a little bit of an opinion video today, looking at the state of boss killing in patch 3.24. There was a huge overhaul in 3.24 to most of PathOfExile's aspirational endgame. So this doesn't touch on things like the Searing Exarch or the regular version of the Maven fight. Instead, it touches upon their Uber versions, how you access them, and a whole bunch of other things. I just want to start though by saying that obviously I've got opinions on this and I want to just get what those opinions are out of the way. I'm going to try and represent other opinions as fairly as I can, but I'm clearly not going to do as good a job representing those as I will of my own. So I'll just get that out of the way. I broadly speaking like the changes that took place in 3.24, but I don't think they were perfect. I think they fixed a lot of problems that existed in the 3.18 to 3.23 era of the game. They also created some new problems, ones that I think need to be fixed for 3.25. Anyways, with that out of the way, there's one little small rant that I want to make, and that is that the Uber version of the Uber Elder fight, the naming of this is ridiculous. It's really confusing when you want to talk about the non-Uber version of Uber Elder. There are times that it's abundantly clear from the context of a conversation that you're talking about Uber Elder monster level 84 Shaper plus Elder, or that you're talking about the monster level 85 Shaper plus Elder fight. But there's other times that it's a little bit ambiguous. I think the worst of this ambiguity though is when new players are involved. A new player might feel, oh, I've defeated the Uber Elder encounter, maybe now I'll go and do Uber Shaper. That can't be too much harder, can it? And then of course they go into the Uber Shaper encounter and they get utterly and comprehensively crushed by it because it is a huge jump up in difficulty from the level 84 Shaper plus Elder encounter, and they're not expecting that. For that reason, I'd really like Grinding Games to change the official name of the Uber Elder encounter. The name Uber Elder made a lot of sense back in patch 3.2 when it was genuinely a top level endgame encounter. It was miles harder than anything else in the game at that point. That's no longer the case, and I think that changing it would be something that would clarify things for new players going forward. There's plenty of things you could call it: Decay Bane, Excision or Expulsion because you're cutting out or expelling the Elder from the Atlas. Whatever you want to call it, I don't really care, just as long as you can have a clear name and then an Uber version of that name that doesn't have this convoluted Uber moniker that everyone ends up getting wrong. Rant aside, let's just go through what the 3.18 to 3.23 endgame looked like. So prior to 3.24, Pinnacle bosses and Uber Pinnacle bosses shared their entry tokens. If you put in a Shaper set into the map device, it would take you to the Shaper at monster level 84 if you did not allocate Cosmic Wounds on your Atlas. And if you did have Cosmic Wounds allocated, it would instead take you to the Uber version of that, which would be the monster level 85 version. Now, most of the time, the Uber versions dropped the same loot as the non-Uber versions, but they had a couple of extra items added to their drop pool, and most of these were pretty rare. How popular these Uber-only items were varied a lot, from Progenesis at the extremely popular end through to Uber in Presence at the unpopular end. And this is something that had a huge impact on how popular the Uber versions of these Pinnacle bosses were. So for instance, the Enhanced in Presence just wasn't creating a pool to fighting Uber Elder, whereas Uber Maven's drop pool was so good that people who were running the Uber version of the Maven fight, they would bid up the price of the Maven's Writ to far more than could be justified by someone who was running the non-Uber version of the Maven and therefore getting the more restrictive drop pool of the non-Uber version of the fight. One stat I would really love to see from this era is what percentage of Uber Searing Exarch kills in 3.23 were done by players who killed that boss more than 100 times on its Uber version during the length of that league. I expect this would be quite high. Let's talk a little bit more about that. What was the problem with the old system? So the non-Uber Pinnacle bosses were frequently just a waste of an access token to run. This was most true for the Maven and for Venarius in the Cortex, but it was also true of a bunch of the others as well. If you couldn't beat the Uber version, the correct thing to do was generally to sell the access token to someone who could beat the Uber version, and then do the non-Uber version once for whatever milestone unlocks came from it. For example, favoured map slots from Cyrus, and again favoured map slots from Cortex, and then again from the Feared. And then once you've done them once, you never touch them again. There's also an enormous gulf in difficulty, and this was between the non-Uber version of the Pinnacle boss fight and then the Uber version of the Pinnacle boss fight. There wasn't very much in between. So that's what Grinding Games tried to overhaul in patch 3.24. Probably the most important thing though was that because so many of the bosses that were being run on the Uber version, anything that Grinding Games wanted to be a chase item that came from the Uber version of the fight had to be extremely rare. Otherwise, it just ceased to be a chase item, it got oversupplied, and in the Trade League economy, no one really cared about it. Good example of this at the moment in patch 3.24 is the Massive Thread of Hope. This is probably the best item on Sirius's loot pool between both the normal version of the encounter and the Uber version of the encounter. It's incredibly strong, and this league, because it seems to have a drop rate in the 50 to 60% range on the Uber version of the Sirius encounter, it ends up being extremely cheap. In fact, it's far cheaper than the non-Massive Thread of Hopes are, which are generally considered to be weaker than the Massive version, although not for every build. So last league, there were tens and tens of thousands of people running Exarch altars day in, day out. And this meant that there was a very large number of Exarch invites in circulation, and this is the reason that those Uber-only items had to be quite rare if they were going to be valuable at all. And then you had the professionalization of boss killing. Boss killers could trade for a huge number of these invites and then just run them back to back. I am not exaggerating, there were people who were literally running 500 Uber Searing Exarchs a day. The same was happening for Eater of Worlds, and while it wasn't quite happening for the Maven, it was pretty close. The Maven just had more phases and so it took longer. You couldn't do 500 of them in a day, but there were people doing more than 250. The ones that took a bit longer, like the Uber Shaper, these were not getting grinded out quite as frequently, but they were still being done in a pretty optimized way. What this meant though was that these hyper-professionalized boss killers were flooding the market with drops in Trade League, and they were also bidding up the price of the access token. And the ultimate consequence was that bossing was terrible currency per hour unless you were one of these hyper-professionalized boss killers, in which case it was actually very competitive with a lot of other things you could do, and possibly even better. Do it the best way, or don't do it at all. This made more casual boss killing not really an option. Going and buying 10 Maven's Writs and running them almost always resulted in a loss, because it was something like 1 in 60 to get Progenesis from her, and the value of the Maven's Writ in trade was being driven by the demand coming from these people who were doing 500 a day, and those players had the bankroll to endure going 175 Writs without getting a single Progenesis, as long as they were reasonably confident that eventually they would start getting the flasks again and start recouping some of those losses. And who knows, maybe along the way they'd get an Awaken Enlighten or an Awaken Empower or something like that and really catapult ahead. So yeah, if these items like Progenesis had a higher drop rate in 3.23, they would have just ended up being like Legacy of Fury or Hyri's Truth, really cheap items that could be very useful and could be very widely used, but that weren't something that was going to drive people to run specific content anymore. So the 324 Overhaul comes along. The Uber and non-Uber versions of each of the Pinnacle bosses now have different access keys to each other and also have different loot to each other. Basically, the old access keys remain for the non-Uber versions, but the new access keys are gated behind the new Tier 17 map bosses. When you defeat a Tier 17 map boss, you often get 2 of these new fragments, and you need 5 of them in order to access one of these bosses. Now, a little bit more on the exact numbers that you get each map, we'll come to that later. But overall, the access to bosses is pretty similar to what it was between 3.18 and 3.23, but it's now split between normal versions and Uber versions, and they have different loot to each other, and some of the things that used to be really rare are now quite common. For example, the Massive Thread of Hope. Some of the things that used to be extremely rare are now just uncommon, like Progenesis, which seems to have about a 10 to 13% drop rate now. Ultimately though, these Uber exclusive uniques are generally a lot easier to get than they were in the past, if you're able to beat all of the relevant content. One thing that's important, a lot of people don't seem to realize some of the mechanics on how Tier 17 map drops work, and then how the fragment drops work. So I quickly want to go over that, because I think that a lot of people think that it's all RNG as to which boss that you get, and that's not the case. Each boss fragment is heavily biased towards on 2 out of the 5 different Tier 17 maps. Cortex is a bit of an exception here. The Uber Cortex is tied to 3 of the maps instead, but it has a weaker bias. And for reasons we'll come to in a sec, the Uber Maven is by far the most important of these bosses, and that's something that I think is a real problem this league that we'll come to later. Her fragment overwhelmingly comes from the Ziggurat and Abomination maps. So if you're running those, then you'll get lots of the Maven fragments, whereas if you're running other Tier 17s, you'll almost never see a Maven fragment. Now this bias is really big, and to give you an example here, there was a group of players that ran 764 Abomination maps, and they got 446 Uber Maven fragments, 463 Uber Exarch fragments, 315 Uber Cortex fragments, and only 269 of the other 4 fragments all put together. So that should give you a bit of a sense that it's something like 5 or 6 times as likely to get the ones that you're biased towards on your particular map. Now you also have agency over which Tier 17 maps are allowed to drop. The tile set that you're in determines which Tier 17 you get, and this is a hard rule. This is not a biasing, this is just absolute. Rather infuriatingly though, this information is not available in-game at all. I'll put a link down below to the PoE wiki that has a list of all of this information for every map in the game. As an example of this though, when you're running Waste Pool, the only tier 17 that is a valid drop is Abomination. The 4 Shaper Guardian maps are wildcards and they can drop all 5 of the tier 17s. So how do the fragments drop? It seems like you get 1 fragment baseline for killing the map boss, plus an additional 1 per 400% item quantity on the map. And if you don't reach 400%, which most of the time you won't, then instead you'll get a percentage chance based on how close you are. I'm not 100% certain that this formula is exactly right, but it's definitely pretty close. It's got a high predictive power based upon a sample of over 1,000 tier 17 maps. And I'm burning a link into the video here with all of the fragments that drop. So Abomination drops the Maven, Exarch and Cortex primarily. Citadel map primarily drops Cortex, Shaper and Uber Elder fragments. Fortress map, Shaper, Uber Elder and Cirrus. Sanctuary primarily drops Exarch, Eda and Cirrus. And Ziggurat primarily drops Maven, Eda and Cortex. And remember that this bias is at least 5 to 1, so you'll almost never see one of the other 4 on any given map. Now, if you watch PathOfExile subreddit, you might have seen this screenshot from streamer Velnia. Now, here she has set up a situation to get an absolutely crazy map. It's a ridiculously cool screenshot where there's a huge amount of monsters and each of them is firing 13 projectiles at a time. So, if you opt in to making your tier 17s as hard as possible, like Velnia has done here, then yes, they are going to be harder than Uber Pinnacles. But this is really a case of Granny Games giving players agency to make ridiculous encounters, and this has come through the Atlas Keystone back to basics. One of the problems that comes up every time Granny Games do something like this is that there are players like Velnia who are good enough to handle this sort of madness, and then there's a lot of players who are not at Velnia's level, including myself. I would get absolutely instantly deleted if I was to come into a map like this on any of my characters in this league. And the problem is when people in that second category spec into something crazy like back to basics, and then end up blaming something else for their death other than back to basics. There's a lot of people who are speccing into tier 17 back to basics and just getting absolutely destroyed and concluding that tier 17s are too hard. Actually, the problem here is not tier 17s, it is back to basics. And this is an extreme outlier here. If this was a tier 1 map instead of a tier 17, there would still be more than half as many projectiles on the screen. It would still be absolutely and utterly ridiculous. The reason for this is that map mods are scaled to 320% of their base effect on this map. So monsters fire 4 additional projectiles is scaled up to monsters fire 12 additional projectiles. Or the tier 1 map mod version of that, which is monsters fire 2 additional projectiles, that would be plus 6. Additionally, there's a map mod that's 40% less player life recovery rate that's in tier 6 maps. If that was going to be run with this particular Atlas that Velnia's got here, then that would be 128% less life recovery, aka completely and utterly bricking the map for most builds. Essentially, you won't see a scenario like this in a tier 17 unless you ask the game to do this to you. And if you ask the game to do this to you, then it will definitely do so. So is this better or worse than the old system? I wanted to start by tackling the question of variety. The old system, Uber Pinnacle access mostly was tied to destructive play. So the Uber Pinnacles, the access tokens for them, you had the Shaper maps, you had the Elder maps, you had the Elder Slayer maps, you had the Cortex, and you had the Maven herself. All of the access keys to these were pretty much tied to having destructive play on your Atlas and running the 12 Atlas mini-bosses and the invitations that came from them. The Shaper Guardians, the Elder Guardians, and the Elder Slayers. There were also the Searing Exarch and the Eater of Worlds, which came from their own influences. Now all 7 of them come from tier 17 maps. Tier 17 maps are in this weird place where they have a number of you must roll over this mods. These will vary from build to build. Additionally, there are some really heinous monster packs that are present in tier 17 maps. Ultimately though, what I think we're seeing is that tier 17s are just unfamiliar content for most people, and they impose different requirements on characters, and these aren't as understood by the entire playbase as tier 16s or even as Uber Pinnacle bosses. For example, you can have an Ice Trapper that has absolutely no defenses, and they can be one of the best killers for the Uber Searing Exarch and the Uber Eater of Worlds. They can just delete those bosses in no time at all. On the flip side, that Ice Trapper is going to have a very bad time in tier 17 maps. There's different requirements. Essentially, tier 17s require rounded characters, as you need to be able to do both a difficult trash phase where a lot of unpredictable stuff can go on, and then you need to also defeat a difficult boss. Likely you'll do this on the same character, at least if you're trying to do them efficiently. And this is the key difference to the 323 era. 323 era, most of the time you would farm access on one character, then you would either run the uber bosses on another character, or you would sell them to an entirely different player, who would then go and batch run them. Essentially, tier 17s require you to be able to do both parts of this yourself. I do think tier 17s are probably actually easier than Uber Pinnacle bosses in general, but there are well understood ways to specialize a character to be extremely good against Uber Pinnacle bosses that don't work against tier 17s. And that's the reason that we have a section of the player base now that used to be able to farm their own Uber Pinnacle boss access fragments and then defeat those Uber Pinnacle bosses, and these players cannot do that anymore. And they're now reliant upon trading in order to access those Uber Pinnacle bosses. So that's the negative of the changes. The positive is that there's new bosses to kill, new content to experience. For me, it being fresh outweighs the bad, but there's definitely others that disagree on this. The other thing that's really noticeable though, and I think this has been the biggest single problem with patch 3.24, tier 17s drop disruptively large amounts of normal loot, i.e. things that could drop anywhere else in the game, and this transforms the league economy in a big way. This is the reason people are taking unique leather belts off their loot filters. It's because Headhunter is now so cheap, because so many of them drop in tier 17s, that it's no longer worth even mouse-overing unique leather belts, and this has turned a number of other things that used to be exhilarating drops, like a Calandra's Touch, into drops that are much more mundane, much less exciting than they used to be. That's going to be something that's going to be very difficult for grinding your games to get right, especially because in 3.24 you have Orthflow members, which are another type of multiplier that really confuse things further. I wanted to have a quick look at some of the ideas that I've seen proposed around the internet, both on the PathOfExile subreddit and also in other places, and start by looking at the prospect of reverting to the 318 to 323 model. I think the case against here is pretty strong, and that's because the old system was hyper-optimized. Essentially, the only way to engage in boss killing was once every hour or so, go to the Forbidden Trove Trade Discord and find someone who was going to sell you 75 Exarch invitations, buy them all off them, and spend the next hour running them. An hour later, you rinse and repeat. If you weren't doing this, you were just so much less efficient than the people who were, that essentially boss killing wasn't worth your time. The other big drawback here is that I think a lot of people will get very annoyed at the idea of an item like Progenesis going back to being as rare as it was in patch 3.23. The second option is related to that, and that is reverting to the 318 to 323 model, but keeping high drop rates on items like Progenesis that people do want. I think the best example here is to look at items that are genuinely best in slot on at least somewhat popular builds, but that have very high drop rates already, and have a look at what the Trade League economy thinks on them. Legacy of Fury is one of these, but I think the best example of this is the Fledgling, the unique helmet that drops from the Nashta heist. This has a drop rate of 100%. This is the best item in the game for ranged attack characters that are not able to pick up Far Shot as a Deadeye Ascendancy node for whatever reason. However, because of the 100% drop rate, the item is completely worthless in trade. I think it's good that there are some items like this that exist, some items that are unique items that are really good that you can count on getting, but they're not loot. Once you've done the encounter once, they are just ground clutter. You sort of see the same thing with Massive Thread of Hope this league, which is another very good item, and it's something that is pretty close to worthless this league. The third model is the one that I actually think is the worst of these, but it's also the one that is the most popular, and this is to change the Uber Pinnacle boss access to the Atzri/Beachhead/Breachstone model, where the way that you get access to the Uber version of the encounter is to grind the non-Uber version repeatedly. I think Beachhead is the most pure of these, because there is no other way to get a tier 16 Beachhead other than very rare Veldo maps. And really, I think the case against here is that if you can do the Uber version of the encounter, the non-Uber one is not going to be fun in any way. It's just going to feel like a chore. For that reason, I really don't like this idea. I think it's going to feel at its absolute worst if you're the sort of player who is trying to learn one of the Uber versions of these fights. So you go and you farm up 25 of the normal Searing Exarch entry tokens, you run them all and you get 5 entry tokens into the Uber Searing Exarch, and then you sit there and you fail them all. And you are going to feel absolutely and positively crushed that you now have to go through and run 25 of the normal version of the fight again in order to get another 5 shots at the Uber version again. Fundamentally, I think this would be the least fun of the options that I've seen around. The next option is what I term the Delve or the 3.9 to 3.16 Cyrus model. So this is a higher drop rate on the bosses, but with mechanics that interfere with trading away the content to bulk runners. So if you're someone who is looking to run other people's Ahuatotli the Blind, there's a lot of inconvenience around you bulk purchasing them from other players, and as a result, most people run their own or engage a boss killer service to do it. I think the case against this one is that players object to trade friction, but the thing that they object to really, really highly is when trade friction is imposed after it goes through a period of not existing, which would be the case here. Players don't really mind that you have this high trade friction on Ahuatotli or All the Crystal King, but if you were to then go and impose this on bosses that don't have it at the moment, I think you would see an absolute PathOfExile player base riot again. It'd be like a repeat of the removal of Harvest. The next proposal is something that targets the people who professionalize boss killing. So this is something that imposes restrictions on them without really affecting the rest of the player base all that much. Something that doesn't affect you if you're doing casual bossing, but that it will affect you a lot if you're trying to do them in bulk. And this is what I term the Shaper model. Higher drop rates, because the Shaper's most important drop is 100% drop rate, it's the fragment, but with time delays added to each fight that prevent you from spam running the encounter. It is simply not possible to defeat the Uber Shaper in less than about 2 minutes and 10 seconds, to the best of my knowledge. I'm sure someone might have a meme build that can do it slightly faster, but last league I checked with players who had a whole bunch of affliction specific power and were running Uber Shaper in an extremely professionalized way, and they were just simply not getting it under 2 minutes and 10 seconds, even 2 minutes and 20 seconds a run. The case against this though is that players loathe it, especially if you add it into existing content. Even if grinding your game's intended as a buff to boss killing, and it is a buff to boss killing, it's still just going to end up feeling like a nerf to quality of life to the player base in general. So I don't think that that's something that would go down very well. And finally, I've seen a few people suggest what I term the World of Warcraft model for bosses. This is higher drop rates, items bind on acquire, and there are timed lockouts after you defeat content. So for instance, instead of the Uber Maven having maybe a 1 in 1,000 chance of dropping Awakened in power, maybe that comes up to being 1.5%. But once you defeat the Uber Maven, you're not allowed to attempt the fight again until 24 hours of real world time have elapsed. The case against here is that of course this is just the highest possible form of trade friction. Making things bound is the highest possible level of trade friction you can have. It goes against a lot of the philosophies that PathOfExile's had. It wasn't particularly popular when it was done in Sanctum League, even though Sanctum League overall was very popular. The testing of bound to account character power that was done in that league certainly didn't seem to be all that popular. And it would feel extremely, extremely bad if you're one of the players who is locked out of trying some particular build because there's a build-defining unique item that just doesn't seem to want to drop for you. I think ultimately the pattern here is that players are very, very good at optimizing the fun out of systems in games. If there is a reward to do a boss multiple times, the efficient way to do it isn't to have 50,000 players each do that boss 5 times and then trade between themselves until everyone's got the item they want. Instead, the most efficient way is just for a small percentage of the player base, maybe 500 players, to do that boss 500 times each and optimize all the fun out but maximize the rewards that they can get. I want to talk quickly about my own suggestion here, and the idea here is that it's going to keep tier 17s as pretty central to bossing, but they're not going to be mandatory the way they are now. So if there's something that you like, you'll be able to do them and that will get you access to Uber Pinnacles. But if they're not something you like, then you can do some other content instead. But firstly, I think the most important problem we've got at the moment is that too much of the Uber Pinnacle loot is tied to one fight, and that is the Uber Maven. She has Progenesis, which is arguably the best of the Uber Boss exclusive unique items, and she has the Awakened Exceptional Gems, and she's the best source of other Awakened Gems as well. And she's the best source of Orbs of Conflict. My suggestion here is that grinding gear games move Awakened Gems so that they don't just come from the Uber Maven for the Exceptionals and from the regular Maven for the non-Exceptionals, but they come from all of the Uber Pinnacles instead. Uber Maven will remain very popular because she has the Flask. Secondly, the game has a large suite of other bosses that are not tier 17 map bosses, but that are genuinely tougher than the standard versions of Pinnacle bosses. So tougher than the regular Maven, tougher than the level 84 version of the Shaper plus Elder fight. These bosses could potentially all drop Uber fragments at varying different drop rates. For example, you kill Nashtra in the unique heist, 20% to get a Pinnacle fragment. Kill Kurgle in the Delve Mines, 100% to get one. Clear a Veldo map that's got one of the heinous mods like Union of Souls, you get fragments for that. Clear the Feared. If you're clearing the Feared, you definitely have no trouble with the regular version of the Maven fight. So instead of giving you 1 or 1 and a bit access tokens to the regular version of the Maven encounter, Why not give a few Crescent Splinters, but most of the loot be Uber Boss fragments? Beat a Flawless Breachstone, maybe that's worth 1 or 2 fragments. There's a bunch of other things as well. Maybe you get a 10% chance when you complete a Blight Ravage map. There's a whole lot of other content that could conceivably have these tied to them. And really the goal here is that Tier 17s become not the only way to access these Uber Pinnacle bosses, but they become perhaps the default way. The way that you get there if you don't specialize in other content. If you do specialize in other content, then you can get the Uber Pinnacle boss access fragments that way instead. Anyways, a fairly long video there, whole lot of opinions. Hopefully it's been interesting. May your Varlobs have interesting results, and I will see you around.